Here we go. All right. So thank you everybody for coming. I'm going to, as you can see, this is the avoid boring and repetitive discussions and put some joy back into teaching and learning. So if this isn't the session you were expecting, stay here anyway. We would love to have you. Anyway, I'm trying to switch the slide. So here's our exciting agenda for the day, our introductions, which of course will be fun. We'll talk about the difference between discussions, the standard discussion boards, and what we consider actually to be more of a learning community. Then we'll go into sort of design and pedagogy principles, and also changing those student behavior patterns. And hopefully we'll have enough time left for a Q&A session. And I assume you know that stands for question and answers. So let's start with the introductions, and I'll go first because I'm already talking. I'm Bob Erdischek. I'm Yellowdig's senior academic solutions architect, and I come from a teaching and learning background. At around a little bit before the turn of the century, I transitioned into higher education and teaching. Before that, I was a lawyer. That didn't really take though. And so at the turn of the century, after doing some teaching, I started working as an instructional technologist, faculty developer, where my role, again, back then, was to help help instructors put their classes online, whether then it was in a distance format. We had just come from VHS tapes for the distance classes. But also, even then, we were piloting sort of a blended, introducing online elements to the face-to-face classroom. And while I love personally the promise of online learning, I felt like the tools and the pedagogy didn't really create the engagement and learning community and the ability for students to sort of surface in a way that they couldn't in a face-to-face class or online that I was looking for. So I left that and I moved on to teaching political science, my own classes for over a decade. And in my own classes, I stayed away from the learning management systems, because of some of those reasons I already mentioned. And I tried all kinds of crazy things. As you can see, I'm like an old guy. I was using AOL Instant Messenger in my classes. I tried all these weird blog things. I don't think I ever used MySpace. Might have, I'm not sure if I experimented with MySpace or not, but also used things like Twitter and Facebook groups, and they came with their own set of problems. I was never very comfortable telling my students to be on that kind of Wild West public platform with people taking their information and all that kind of stuff. In any case, and they didn't really get the results I wanted to get. In any case, I found Yellowdig, which is where I am now, and I loved it. It ticked all the boxes for me, and now I work to support our users, our instructors, in sharing best practices in pedagogy and helping in whatever way I can to help them figure out how Yellowdig works and how to build learning communities in your class. And with that, I'm going to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Brian Burdine.
Hi, everyone. I'm Yellowdig's head of client success. My background is all in psychology and education. I got my PhD from Vanderbilt and then went and did a postdoc in the education department at the University of Delaware. Most of my research focused on sort of learning from informal learning situations. And that's how I got interested in ed tech and the concept of gamification. But I started at Yellowdig about 3 years ago to apply those research skills to our data and to talking to instructors about the platform and how to get the most out of it. So I've done a lot of the research, some of which we're going to present today, some in collaboration with other people. If you do decide to use Yellowdig and you want to think about a study with me, I'm happy to do it. But really excited to be here and talk through some of this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Oops, now I got to make the slide go. Oh, there we go. Oops. So, we all think about what makes learning better. I mean, that's why we're here. We're people who support learning and teaching, and we love to teach. And some of the things, there are lots of things that make learning better, but the things that we're going to sort of focus on are relevance, the idea that students can interact with what they're learning and see how it connects to what they're doing, whether that's through personal experiences, what's going on in the world, you know, all kinds of other, what the newest information, that obviously the ideas of critical thinking, the instructor role, having the guiding hand of the instructor, and also that social and emotional support that you can get from peers to help you learn. And we talk a lot about the community of inquiry framework, which has these three pillars: the teaching presence, that one-to-many, the instructor sharing the information and disseminating it and guiding where students should go; the cognitive presence, students doing an assignment, doing reading, reflecting on the material; and then finally, that social presence, interacting with each other to reflect on learning, to learn more from each other. You know, if we're in a class and Brian and I are in a class together, and you know, you're the instructor and we both hear what you say, but maybe we have different perspectives on it. When we speak together, we can maybe learn and get a different perspective from each other, among other things. And the thing is that teaching presence and that cognitive presence are firmly entrenched in what we do. But that social presence is either sometimes ignored or assumed when it might not be there. And for example, in those social assignments, the so-called social assignments in online pedagogy, the prompts that people write to and are supposed to comment to their peers, and we'll go into this deeper. That's really, again, focusing primarily on the teaching and the cognitive presence, because those prompted discussions are written towards the instructor and are focused exactly on what the instructor wants to hear. And in face-to-face classes, when everyone's together in a room, we often assume, oh, well, that's social, right? But again, the instructor is leading those discussions. They're 50 minutes 3 times a week, or an hour and 20 minutes twice a week, or what have you. And really, the instructor is the focus and the nexus of all that conversation. Even if the instructor is doing more than lecturing and there's engagement, it's all coming through the focus of the instructor. And then you might say, well, Bob, but students get to be together in the room and talk to each other, you know, before and after class. And realistically, maybe they're talking to each other for 5 minutes before class to the person next to them or the person behind them, but you're not really getting interactive learning with the people in the back row, in the front row, or even in the middle row. And in the class, you've got the people who are raising their hands, who are really the folks who are getting the most attention. Brian, is there anything else you'd like to add to this at this point?
No, I think a lot of times the assessment piece that's there in the slide is also part of it. A lot of people will try to put assessment into something that's social, and a lot of times that assessment can sort of disrupt real communication, or you know, keep students from, I don't want to say taking risks, but sort of going out on a limb and possibly being wrong. I mean, it's typical in a conversation for people to say things, you know, in a conversation and have somebody push back, and they have to be able to take those risks. And maybe the other thing is that by putting in assessments, a lot of times the students are trying to figure out what the instructor wants to hear, rather than thinking about the students as the audience. So that's another sort of factor to think about as you're, you know, enabling social presence.
And before I transition to the next slide, if I can manage to transition to the next slide, I want to point out the yellow shovel behind Brian. That's the official Yellowdig shovel, because we are here on behalf of Yellowdig today. And what you're looking at now is Yellowdig as embedded in a learning management system. Yellowdig can work through LTI connection with your learning management system, or it can be used outside of your learning management system. And I thought we would take a minute to sort of let you know what Yellowdig is. Although we're not planning on doing a full Yellowdig demo here today, we're talking about the pedagogy more than anything else. But Yellowdig, so you know, is a social learning platform that resembles social media, but certainly isn't social media. It's designed from the ground up for higher education to encourage course relevant discussions and our gameful learning point system, and get students back into the platform to create, to not only to come in regularly, but also to have better conversations. And we'll get into that a little bit later. Brian, anything you want to add about the platform itself before we move on?
Not that we'll cover, I think, a lot of the rest of it later. So I think the next slide sort of digs into one of the things that I like to talk about, um, in terms of building success. And I think that this applies broadly, regardless of what type of technology you might be trying to use, and your course design. When you're thinking about a social element, it's sort of a fact and a challenge that each student's behavior is going to impact the learning of every other student, right? Because if they're interacting with each other, they're going to be influencing others. That's a sort of unique part of a social aspect of a course. And it's really important to think about because you can either have student behaviors be good and sort of build a positive feedback loop where other students will start sort of doing things that make the experience more valuable for others. Or you can have the alternative where certain student behavior patterns start to create kind of a spiral in the opposite direction. And it's something to think about as you're designing social elements because it's sort of unavoidable.
And there's also those students who don't participate in that social environment as well, and that affects things too.
Yeah, so the typical social assignment in a lot of cases will look like this in a course, right? And uh, we noticed a couple of problems in this sort of design as we have been building the technology. And we view a lot of these as sort of an unavoidable aspect of the standard sort of discussion or social assignment framework, which is often that an instructor will create an assignment, give them a week or a module to do that assignment in a social tool, um, and and then go on to a new assignment the next module. Usually in sort of like a bunch of different separate spaces, so that there's a specific board or community or space for one of those conversations, and then you go on to another one. Um, there's the downsides to that are pretty much unavoidable are that the go-getter students that come in are coming into a space that's empty, where there's nobody really to interact with, and until people start interacting, you're getting a cold start every week, right? There's nothing there, and so even the go-getters kind of learn that they can procrastinate, or that there's no point in being there early, so they just start to procrastinate more and more. Um, and by giving a deadline itself, you're sort of telling people it's okay to wait until that deadline to participate. But when you're trying to get people to socially interact with one another, they need time to do that. Um, and so you end up with conversations or interactions that are really restricted. The other thing for the procrastinating students that come right before the deadline is that they might be doing their posts and they might be commenting on other students or interacting with other students' content, but nobody is coming in after them and interacting with them. So they're not really having a social experience at all. And maybe if you think about some of those procrastinating students, maybe they're the least prepared and need sort of the most help. Maybe they're students that are feeling overwhelmed by school and could benefit from having some social interactions. Maybe they're least interested in the subject and it could do them some good to sort of get more involved in it and have some more conversation around it. But whatever the case may be, they're not really interacting socially. If you have
Michael,
anything to add to that, Bob.
yeah, a few things, Mr. Dr. Bryan. So, everything Brian said, I agree with, but I think that it's fair to say that even if the student isn't procrastinating, I mean, and these students may not be procrastinating, this model builds that in. This is an assignment with a due date, Sunday at midnight. And so students organize their lives in that way. I have other things to do. I have other classes. I have work to go to, what have you. So I'm going to wait until this is due to do this assignment. So even if that procrastinator student is motivated, they're doing what they need to do. They're getting in on time. But here, just when that conversation can get good, it's over for everybody except for that poor instructor. who now has to read all those posts, those 200 or 300 word posts written to that prompt that are all going to be very similar. And I used to score APUS government exams. And over the course of 10 days, me and 700 other fun folks would look at, well, together over 1 million posts written to the same prompt. And myself, I would do about 5,000 of those over that period of time. And that's not the most exciting work in the world. And what might be better, not only for the students, but for the instructor. Oh, I'm sorry, we forgot about this part of the deal. Forgot about this slide. We'll get to the other part soon. Brian, I believe this is you, honestly. So anyway, the point I wanted to make was that I think we might have a better way, not only for the instructor, but for the students and for the instructor. Brian?
Yeah, I mean, as you consider the sort of good and bad of highly structured discussions, and you know, as we talk more, we'll be talking a lot about that. But you know, when you're prompting students and putting in assignments that they have to respond to, there's a really clear focus. Some students really like that structure. Certainly in school, a lot of people are sort of used to being told what to do. They know the rules of the game, and they sort of do it. But there are some damaging sort of behavior patterns, or ways that they interpret those assignments that that you definitely have to think about, regardless of you know what you're using to do it. I think one thing we see is that when people are using assignments, they're communicating to students that there's only one allowed purpose for that space, right? So if a student has a question, they can't ask it in their discussion board or in their community, because you know, the only thing you're allowed to do there is those assignments. And a lot of, you know, we see a lot of professors sort of inviting their students to talk more or share in addition. But the fact is, students kind of interpret those assignments as this is what the discussion board is for, or this is what the community is for, and that's the only thing that they'll do there. We definitely see sort of less topical and temporal relevance because in most cases the prompts are made way in advance. And so students sort of have to talk about things that may not be top of mind. There may be better examples that just happened in the past week. The other thing is students really just think of their role as kind of checking off the assignment. They don't think of it as being having a good conversation or strong interaction. So those are some things as you consider sort of the good and the bad of more structured discussion forums and community roles as you're designing.
So, as you remember that other slide just a second ago? This one? Yeah, probably. Our slide that represents Yellowdig communities is very different, as you can see. There's a number of things I want to point out to you right off the bat. First of all, you can see that that instructor icon isn't really at the beginning of all these dots and dashes, which represent conversations. Sometimes a student can be initiating these conversations. We'll talk about that in a minute. Also, Yellowdig conversations, there's no little red line here ending the conversation. In Yellowdig, conversations can ebb and flow based on what's relevant, what's important, what's going on in the world for students and in related to the topic. So I'll give you one silly, well, it's not silly, one example. I taught American government for a very long time. And in week 2 of my intro course, we would talk about the Constitution, which frankly should be the whole course, but that's another story. Anyway, in week 2, we talk about you know, the Article 2, which is the president, the powers of the president, the presidential election, the electoral college, and all how that works. And of course, last fall, there was a presidential election and all that stuff is going on. And if in week 7, the electoral college is actually taking that vote, they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. Do I want my students to reflect on that? And obviously this is a rhetorical question in this case. But my answer is yes, for a couple of reasons. First of all, I want to see them processing that information. I want to see that they understand what's going on. This is a great learning exercise for them. The second piece of that is it tells me, do they get it? Do they understand what's going on? Do I need to spend more time in here? And when they're talking about that, I can see that. And I can address this before the end of the semester, before they're assessed on this. I can go back and look and see what's happening and be involved in that. All right, so that's one piece. The other piece is right here, questions. So when students have agency and feel comfortable asking questions, that's a really important learning experience. They don't want to feel stupid. They want to feel like this is welcome for me to ask questions and there's a forum for me to do it. But maybe even better than that is when they have the power to answer each other's questions. There's another piece that's really important here. The ability to, when you have to answer a peer's question, it makes you say, okay, first of all, do I understand the question? Second, do I know the answer? And third, can I communicate that answer to my peers in a way that they'll understand? So answering students' questions is really an important learning process. And in Yellowdig, students can do both that. They can ask and answer each other's questions. In fact, if the instructor, tells students, don't send me an email with your questions, post all those questions that aren't of a personal nature in Yellowdig, and then tells students to go ahead and try to answer them, that really empowers students. And through Yellowdig, we have a feature called accolades, where the instructor then doesn't even have to do it, but can identify the best student answer to sort of point it out to students without having written anything. So this can be really powerful in letting students answer and also sort of reducing that instructor painful part of the workload where they have to answer the same questions over and over again. Anything else you want to add here, Brian?
Sorry, I muted myself so nobody would hear my loud typing. No, I don't think there's a lot to add other than I think that one of the things that we see from a content consumption perspective is that by allowing multiple topics to exist in parallel to one another, students will consume a lot more information because they read all three of them, even if they only participate in one. And one concept that I don't think you can overlook is the importance of consuming content as opposed to generating it. So a lot of assignments are focused around generating content, but people aren't thinking about whether their students are going to consume large amounts of that content, right? So if you tell students they have to post once and comment twice, they're going to read 2 other posts or maybe only 1 other post just so they can comment on that one and they won't read the rest, right? So one thing that you have to think about in structuring a lot of these assignments is whether students are going to willingly consume the information that's there and talk about it, because as some of our data will show later, that's where students really learn the most. They learn the most from consuming the content and then discussing it, not necessarily generating it. So Bob, I think you can go on to the next slide. This is the last one that I think is sort of directly related to Yellowdig, and I want to present it because our point system basically gives points to students when they post or comment. We think of that strictly as a participation grade, similar to like showing up to class. But then there's social points that students get when other students react to their posts or comment on their posts. And those points reward those students that post high quality content, get good conversations going that other students are reacting to. So students think of each other as the audience. But then it also rewards students that come in, get good conversations started, and then continue them. And so that back and forth exchange gets students to come back more often and gets students to really read the other stuff that's there and have meaningful interactions with people. And I mention that primarily because a lot of the benefit from the social elements of a course require that students have exchanges, come back, more often or as often as you can get them there, and to have more than sort of one opportunity to interact per week, right? So if you can build those student behavior patterns into your designs, that's a good way of helping achieve that goal. And maybe one example would be rather than a weekly assignment, have one specific thing students could reply to in any day of the week, and have them only have them only need to participate in one of the conversations, and just release multiple things throughout the week, so that you don't end up with a single deadline one time a week, and you can get students coming back a little bit more often to participate. That would be sort of like a concrete recommendation that I can make.
Are
Go ahead,
you?
Brian.
Yeah, and I'm just going to add that the social points really motivate students to come in earlier in the week, because they learn that by coming in earlier in the week, they can get points from other people commenting and reacting to their posts, which of course means that they've also read their post. So the procrastination is sort of is eliminated, and they also realize that I have to create content that's going to be interesting to my peers and relevant and course relevant. Otherwise, they're not going to post and comment. So even if I go in earlier and I don't procrastinate, if I'm not creating interesting conversations, I'm not likely to get those social points. So it really does change behavior in reducing procrastination and creating better conversations. Oh, here's the slide.
Bob, I'm just looking at time. Do you want to jump to a couple more slides ahead? And
Yeah, sure.
I think I'll jump in there and not to call an audible on you entirely.
Was this the one you wanted?
I think the one before that.
Okay.
So one of the early experiments that we did with Yellowdig was to look at having a single continuous community where all of the content went into one area, versus having unique individual boards for each week of a course, each module. And this shows the results of that initial experiment. But one of the reasons that Yellowdig is now designed around a single scrolling feed, and we have students participate all in one place, is because we found that when you broke discussions into multiple different boards, students would never go back and revisit old discussions, even if there was still plenty of interesting stuff to talk about. So literally, they would come in one week and then they would shift to a completely different space, and they would never revisit those conversations. And we found just by putting them all together that students' participation jumped by 60% or more. So one sort of takeaway, in terms of applying this to other types of technology, or more broadly to course design, is to think about ways that you can sort of not or allow students to re-encounter the social experience and other things that are happening, in order to continue those conversations, rather than do cold starts all the time, and like keep good conversations going, allow them to live a more natural life cycle. That's all I had to say about it.
That's fine. And to go along with this, we generally, as Brian is indicating, discourage those weekly prompted discussions. And this slide makes the point that that procrastination is a learned behavior based on the deadline and the nature of the discussion. I'm going to let you take over, Brian, on this one.
Yeah. So the gray lines in these graphs are sort of the weekly rollover, Sunday at midnight kind of thing, and in open-ended communities, this is within our own technology. In open-ended communities, what we see is that students come in early, start conversations, and then maintain a higher baseline throughout. In these communities, students consistently participate the least on Saturday, which is not surprising if most people have like their Saturdays off, or hopefully family time or whatever. In prompted communities, the busiest day is Sunday evening, and the second busiest day is usually Saturday. So really, that weekly prompting structure helps create weekend warriors, as a lot of people refer to them. And especially if you have working adults, they tend to be reported as wanting to work on the weekends. But I think a lot of times it's just a matter of sort of the way that the course is structured and the way that the incentives are for people, they end up working on the weekend. And we see that pretty consistently in our own tech. So One thing that you want to try to do is encourage students or reward students for coming in early in the week. Um, and maybe, if you're not using the Yellowdig, maybe that's to award additional points for people that, get a conversation started in the first half of the week or something like that. Um, One interesting thing from the support perspective is that when more students are procrastinating, uh, more students report technical problems with the platforms. So you get a lot of sort of like dog ate my homework excuses as an instructor, which I know I didn't like those when I got them as an instructor. But that's sort of one side effect too, is that if students are getting an early start and anything happens the rest of the week, it's not as big of a deal, right? When it happens right before a deadline, it's a problem. And I think some of those excuses are probably just blaming tech. But whatever the case may be, we see kind of a big difference there as well.
Brian, before, I'm not sure if we want to do this before we move on or if we should move on, but Sue asked a good question in the chat, and I'd like to address it. Is that cool if we do that now?
Yeah, go for it.
So Sue asks, is there a concern about lack of topic focus with a free-forming conversation? A free-form conversation, excuse me. And so in Yellowdig, they're not just unfocused conversations. There's a couple of things that help create a focus of the conversations and keep the content course relevant. First of all, I don't know if I mentioned this before, but we view Yellowdig communities not as instructor-led, but rather as instructor modeled. So one of the things that really helps in these communities to keep these conversations focused is the instructor being a citizen of this community, having a presence in the community, and setting expectations for the community at the outset, explaining what the purpose of the community is here. The purpose of our community is to share course relevant information, our own personal experiences related to the course, and to talk about that. My role as the instructor in the community is to be present. I'm not going to read or comment on every single post that you make or every comment that you make. I may occasionally share my own comments. I'm going to share my own passion for the subject matter, but basically the instructor has the opportunity to sort of set the tone for the community. Beyond that, in Yellowdig, we have what we call topic tags, and these topic tags are required. They're a required element of every post, meaning that, and these topic tags should align with the top level subject matter or those conversations that the instructor wants students to be having in the community. And by setting expectations, by modeling that behavior, and by creating these topic tags, conversations do stay course relevant. Brian?
Yeah, I mean, we also handle a little bit of that with the incentive structure, right? If students are posting nonsense, other people don't respond and react to it, and uh, that's part of it as well. But to Bob's point, typically, if students are enjoying the conversations that are happening and they have a little bit of freedom, they share things that are interesting to them and that are relevant. And so we see that sort of surprisingly little policing going on by instructors. And I say surprisingly little because I know sort of like what my assumptions were about how students might behave in Yellowdig before I started working at Yellowdig. And I think sometimes the expectations are based on how students behave in typical circumstances versus when you give them a little bit of this freedom. And I think you can ask them to stay on topic if you're also giving them a little bit of freedom in other areas, and it feels really reasonable, and they really do tend to follow your lead.
You know, oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say also for the instructor, while it's a different experience than being in those standard discussion boards, and the instructor does need to have some presence in the Yellowdig community. I think that instructors are going to find it to be a much more pleasant experience than reading those, prompted discussions, those prompted assignments. All
Yes,
right.
certainly you wouldn't need to spend any more time doing it than you would grading. And by interacting with students, they see that you're there, they see that you care about what's going on, um, and it can really help keep things going.
There we go. Okay.
Um, this is just an example of how some of the different incentive structures can yield different kinds of student behaviors. But one of the things that we focus on at Yellowdig is the comments per post within our communities. And we call that the conversation ratio. And it's basically an indication of how much students are talking about the content that's posted. And what we repeatedly find, and this is one example from one instructor who tried a bunch of different setups over the years, but what we repeatedly find is that higher conversation ratios tend to yield communities that students think are more valuable and that they participate willingly inside. Uh, Most of them getting sort of above the point goal, with huge numbers getting well above the point goal. And you can see the one sort of highest amount of participation that he had was a community that was going 23% over the total goal. And one thing that I always point out in that is like, sure, you could have a lot of participation and maybe it isn't high quality and good, but students aren't going to continue to participate well beyond the goal unless they are experiencing some type of value from participating there. And so in reality, what we find is the students that are participating well above are taking it very seriously. They're having really interesting, deep conversations, and they're participating above and beyond because they are doing that.
And so valuing comments as well as posts is part of the point here, that commenting, that creating those conversations is super important in creating a real learning community and not just valuing the posts themselves.
And a takeaway that can be applied broadly for anybody on that is, most assignments really focus on getting students to produce that initial post, spend a lot of time producing that initial post. Everybody put in APA style and document everything. But if you are focusing students on making a post and making every post this giant thing that nobody is really going to read and interact with, you're losing a lot of the actual discussion in doing so. And so what I would suggest is trying to get quicker to the actual interactive piece of it, and students will consume more content and post really good, interesting stuff if you can find ways to do that, right? So really focus on the actual discussion rather than on the initial creation of content.
Now, we've sort of talked through this to some degree, that these unprompted conversations generally yield a much higher conversation ratio, as Brian was talking about. I know we're getting towards the end of our time. Should we continue to go through the slides, or should we jump into Q&A?
I can swing through these really quick in like 2 minutes, and then get to the Q&A. So, one thing to highlight: this course A was an undergraduate course with 52 members, 16 weeks. Course B, same exact university, with a prompted structure, undergraduate level, and it was a 14-week course. It was 31 members, right? So on a per community or per member basis, they were producing a similar number of posts, but we get a lot more commenting in the open-ended community, and so that conversation ratio is quite a bit higher. There are some results from that, but also you look at the reactions and you see students are reacting to each other's posts quite a bit more, and I think that will become important later. So I'm going to go to the next slide, Bob.
Yeah, and I just want to say about those reactions, a lot of people, the reactions are thumbs up or other emojis that students can enter onto those conversations. And some people think they're extraneous, but really what they indicate is reading. They indicate that people are engaged in the conversation and that they're there. Go ahead, Ryan. Sorry.
Yep, great. So in these two courses, again, we see that students in an open-ended community are more likely to sort of participate above the requirement, above the goal. In prompted conversations, a lot of students start to drop. They certainly don't go above and beyond. You can go to the next slide.
I'm trying.
Okay.
There we go.
In general, we do see that there's more downtime in prompted discussions as well, right? So the the valleys where there's no interactions in the community are tend to be much lower in prompted communities. You can see on the left, most days at least have sort of a minimum of 10 or 20 engagements with a pretty regular baseline of 50, and sort of um, the end result of that is I think on the next slide.
Okay, sorry.
The end result of these behaviors is that students are more likely to be strongly connected in open-ended communities. They're more likely to interact with more students, form more connections, and so even though the one class was smaller, people weren't fully connecting with all of the members there. Go ahead, Bob.
Oh my gosh, I'm sorry. That's the weirdest thing. Okay.
And then on the point of consuming the content, what we see is that when you allow students a little bit more freedom to explore and talk about the topics, and to actually get them talking to one another, they view more posts. So in course A, students viewed 109 posts and reacted much more to more of those posts, whereas in the other community, students were viewing less of the posts and really not reacting to them. So those are indications that they didn't like the content as much. And those voluntary sort of behaviors indicate that in general, prompted communities are going to get students to come back less often, consume less of the content. And so this is just one example of sort of the cascade of effects that happen.
So I think this is the last real slide here. So these conversations are a great formative tool. They can let you know what your students know. They can help you modify your teaching as you're going along. And students find them to be pleasant. They're doing what's interesting to them. They're highlighting that. They're actually taking a role in their learning. And the incentives help get them started, but as they go through the course, those points often become irrelevant and they can exceed those points. And again, these conversations ebb and flow with what's important and relevant and what's happening in the world and related to their their own experiences. Brian?
Yeah, I mean, the reason that we sort of call this putting some joy back in teaching and learning is that we find that instructors are surprised a lot of times what their students will do when you open things up and when you interact with students as sort of a member of the community rather than the grader in the community, right? So I think we want to open it up for any questions that anybody has.
Before we do that, I just want to point out real quick that if you're interested in learning more, or if you want to try Yellowdig, we are offering a free pilot. I'd also let you know that you can contact me or Brian directly. Very complicated email address for me, Bob, that's B-O-B at yellowdig.com, and Brian.Verdine@yellowdig.com, and we would love to hear from you. I also, want to take this opportunity to thank Allison O'Grady, who was our session host. So thanks, Allison. And now we have to take questions. And I think there's one in there's a thank you in the chat. But we've got a few minutes left. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to let us know. While we're waiting, Brian, I thought maybe we could share the platform itself. So I'm going to just switch to that, if that's cool, for the last couple of minutes.
Do we recommend minimum word counts for initial responses or other interactions? So we definitely have minimum word counts in the platform. And I think most, discussion assignments of some sort generally kind of enforce those. I have mixed feelings about them in some cases. What we've found from our own research is that about 40 words tends to yield communities with the most interaction in them. LinkedIn, I think, is 25 words. It's a smaller amount on other types of platforms like LinkedIn, what we find is that if you have no minimum word count or very low, students maybe don't take it as seriously or don't think they have to take it as seriously. If you make them too long, I think there's much more danger in that. But if you make them too long, students just stop reading them. So if you're forcing students to post 250 plus words in order to reach the minimum, they start filling them up with sort of filler. But also other students just don't want to read them. They get too long. And so, I mean, obviously we want students to be reading things, but if you're relying on them to read them in order to have meaningful discussions and to take part in these conversations, you don't want the word count to be too long either. And
So,
comments we usually recommend around 20 words.
And a couple other things while we're in the platform, the topic tags we mentioned before here act as filters, making it easier to follow and find those conversations to allow them to ebb and flow. These little guys up here are the accolades, the badges that allow an instructor to be present in the community without dominating the conversation. In other words, in a conversation that students are having, the instructor can show that I'm here, that I've read the information. I found this to be a really good post or comment, and add the accolade there without saying a word about that as well. And just because you're maybe interested, and feel free to keep asking questions. In posting, there are a number of things you can do in Yellowdig. You can record a video right in the platform. But in addition to recording a video, you could add to the same post a poll or put in a PDF for whatever. In other words, there's a lot more that you can do in here than you can do in a sort of a LinkedIn type of post. And students can always see where they are in trying to reach their point goal within Yellowdig, but the points do pass back to the learning management system if you decide to set it up that way. I guess we only got a couple minutes left. What else can we do for you today? Well,
a lot of people will ask us about sort of how instructors can best interact in these communities, and we've found that students like freedom, but they still like feedback, and they still like to know they're on the right track. That they still like some recognition from the instructor. So while there is this sort of automatic point system going on, we do recommend that you still react to them, comment on them, and those kinds of same principles apply, right, to any kind of these experiences, where students really do highly value sort of the pat on the back. They don't necessarily want you to come in and take over every conversation or comment on everything, and that can actually start driving participation back down. But they do like to know that you're there, that you care what's going on, and they like it when you try to like extend a conversation with them or whatever. And we've gotten, we've heard clear feedback from students in terms of the instructor role, sort of building. And again, that's why we talk about modeling, but sort of like just act like the most excited, sort of interested member of your community, and you can really get students going from that.
Well, thanks again, everybody, for coming. I guess this is the end. And again, because I assume this room has to be used for others for the next session. But really appreciate you coming. Again, please, if you want to learn more, contact me, bob@yellowdig.com. I am not the sales guy, but I can direct you where you need to be. And just check out our website, yellowdig.co.co. There's a lot of information there, case studies, blogs. We have an instructor certification course that only takes about an hour to complete. That'll go deeper into our pedagogy and the platform itself. And we'd love to talk to you some more. Thanks again, everybody.
Bye, everyone.